Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're very honored to have Professor Luiz Oosterbeek to join us on this leading edge lecture series. Luiz has been one of the most sought after speakers around the world, I believe. And we also have actually made an appointment for him to speak last year. Unfortunately, it was, the pandemic broke out, and then we had to stop. And recently, we have managed to kind of the know-how of how to run online speeches. So we again seek him out, and he's so generous. He's very busy, but he's so generous to agree to give this talk for us. Yeah. And let me first introduce him. It's a very brief introduction. Professor Oosterbeek got his PhD in archaeology in 1994, and he's currently professor of the Polytechnic Institute of Tomar, president of the Instituto Terra e Memoria in Portugal, guest professor in several European and Brazilian universities, director of the Museum Prehistorical Art in Massau, and vice president of Hereti International. He's also holder of UNESCO Chair Humanities and Cultural Integrated Landscape Management. He's also supervised 26 PhD theses and 62 master dissertations. A very, very, I believe, admired and sought after advisor. And he's also referee for over 20 scientific journals and research foundation. And he's authored over 300 papers and 70 books. Amazing, amazing. But most importantly, of course, he is the president of the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, or alias CIPSH, which has been sponsoring all kinds of activities across the globe. Mainly, he's conducted his research in the fields of archaeology, heritage, and landscape management in Portugal, Africa, and Southern America. Yeah, maybe one day you'll also do that in somewhere in the Chinese-speaking world. What he's going to talk about today is from global warming into a new ice age, ? Climate, adaptation, and examples from the past. So I presume he's going to cite examples from the past to talk about whether or not global warming is going to, usher in a new ice age. And we started this conversation. I mean, I heard him mention, a little bit of information about this back in 2017. And I was completely fascinated, and I just keep that in mind that someday I'm going to ask him to talk about this in greater detail. And today we are honored to have this opportunity. Okay, Luiz, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I have to thank Professor Sebastian Liao and the University of Taiwan for this invitation. It's a real pleasure. And of course, you were too generous in the introduction, but it is a pleasure. And I keep very, very good souvenirs of all our, not so many, but all of our meetings before. So thank you very much again. I will try to share my screen now.
Okay.
What I will be doing, let me just close this. What I will be doing in the next 90 minutes, more or less, is to bring you a very, I can't go in so much detail in 19 minutes, but anyway, an overview of a very important discussion, of course, we have today about global warming, and how a specific field of knowledge, which is archaeology, can contribute for it. And let me just say, as starters, that I think this sits at the core of a discussion about the contributions of humanities and sciences to our society today. Because as you will see, my basic argument is that we are facing a real problem with the wrong strategy. So there will be 4 moments in my talk. First, trying to clarify the concepts as I use them. Then, which will be the most substantial part, give some examples about past climate and environmental changes, adaptations. Then I will speak a little bit about what probably all of you know as the Great Acceleration, which is, in a sense, the moment we are living in. And finally, I will make some observations about what I believe would be a more efficient, more resilient strategy to face the context we're living in. So first, the concepts. And I think anyone in science, I was about to say anyone in the humanities, but actually anyone in science and anyone in the academic world knows that if you mistreat the concepts and if you don't clarify the concepts, you will then have a discussion that leads nowhere. So this is the first observation, because I think often discussions on issues like sustainability, like climate, like heritage, and many others that we go through these days are pervaded by a poor understanding of the concepts. And this then creates much more noise than conversation. I'm not saying that the definitions I will give are the correct definitions. There is room in some cases for interpretation, but it is important to clarify the concepts. And anyway, this room for discrepancy is limited in any case. So let's start with climate. Climate is a planetary response on the atmospheric circulation to its changing composition. It is primarily related to the solar system configuration, like radiation, for example, the Earth's rotation, the tilt of its axis, namely, and to oceans and continents distributions. And you have seen in this first definition, which is not my definition, it's the definition of climate in science, there is no main reference to the biotic dimension. Of course, the biotic dimension is very important for our lives, for life in general in the planet. So, and when I say biotic, I'm talking about all the living species, vegetation as animals, and of course, including humans. But in terms of climate, the influence of the biotic dimension is really very limited. Because climate is this complex system, it has an ongoing process of movement, of change all the time. And this is induced by, on one hand, internal variability, like the ocean current changes, which is a very, very important dimension, and I'll go back to that, and external factors like volcanoes, tectonics, the solar impact, and so on and so forth. And where do humans sit in this? As any other living being, humans have, of course, some impact in the system, but it's a minor impact. However, humans have a capacity, or have gained the capacity, to interfere in their immediate surrounding environment. And I'll go back to this second concept, environment, in a few minutes. But when it comes to climate, I would say that perceptions of humans on climates are more accurate concerning weather changes and local anthropic action than climate itself. One possible definition accepted by scientists is that you can identify or characterize climate changes in cycles of roughly minimum 30 years based on meteorological data. But we also know that we don't have meteorological data for more than around the last 150 years, more or less, and even that only for some parts of the world. So we estimate climate in other ways through various indicators, and particularly we use deep sea cores to do that, and I will again go back to that in a minute. Because global climate change operates at the time scale that escapes human observation. So we can, of course, understand and perceive if there is a trend for warming or cooling, if there is more rain or less than in the past. We can observe if the sea level is rising a little bit or not in comparison to our experience some decades before. But this doesn't mean we appreciate, except in context of dramatic, abrupt change, that we can appreciate real climatic changes at a global scale. Another thing is what we call microclimates in specific areas. Now, let's go to environment. The environment is a set of physical, chemical, and biotic integrated elements, the ecosystems, that provide the context for life survival and evolution. And here you see that life is already considered a core component of the system. And of course, in life, humans have a central role, particularly now in the last couple of centuries when humans got a capacity to intervene, which is unprecedented. And so, of course, this is much more important. And I think part of the discussions we are having these days in the world relate to a confusion between climate change and environmental change. We are, if you wish, maybe addressing climate change through the filter of the perception of environmental change. And although there is a connection between the two, of course, they are not the same. And the environmental change is something we perceive, is something we can more easily act upon, even to counter to a certain extent. Climate is a completely different thing. And we are facing also global warming and climate change, and I'm not convinced we are having adequate strategies to face it. Human environment relations imply four main variables. One, first is the economic, which relates to production and extraction. There is a large discussion these days about this, for the last few decades actually, on if it is sustainable for humans to keep on having a basically extractive approach to the planet. I think we all understand this strategy alone is not sustainable. And it's not sustainable because it's exhausting the resources and it's destroying the ecosystems. And destroying the ecosystems, the conditions for life in general, but for humans in particular, will tend to disappear. But having said this, it's also not possible to go back into the past. This would be very naive. We have taken as a species a choice. We have made a choice almost 10,000 years ago, which was the choice of producing food and therefore keep on growing as a species. There was an alternative 10,000 years ago, which was to keep on being hunter-gatherers. We would probably still be a very small species, or we might even have disappeared. I don't know. But in any case, once we move in this direction, it's impossible to go back, because the choice of producing food was largely made because of the shortage of natural productivity of nature, if you wish, for sufficient food for the existing number of individuals. A second very important dimension is the social one, which relates to how we distribute the available resources and how we cooperate among us. And the history of humans is primarily an history of cooperation. Of course, when we look around these days, we see lots of tensions, with lots of conflicts, and unfortunately, lots of wars. But it hasn't been like that for most of our past. Most of our past, which would not exclude violence in some contexts, of course, but most of our past was a past of cooperation. And why can we say this? Well, many years ago, an archaeologist called Richard Leakey, son of a very famous couple of paleoanthropologists that worked in Africa, he wrote in a book that we were not there to see if humans were basically cooperating. However, if they didn't, they would have been extinct for a long time, because we are a very weak species. We are not very fast when we run. We're not very strong. We don't have so many protections in our skin, in our body to other agents. So we were much more prey than predators. But our capacity of cooperation, which also occurs in other primates, but with us it's got to more complex levels of integration, was certainly a very important dimension of our success as a species. So cooperation is actually the basis. And if you think a little bit, you will immediately recognize that all of us start in our earliest years by being strongly cooperative. It's the way the society is structured nowadays that often leads many humans to enter a destructive path instead of a cooperative path. This relates to the third level, which is the institutional. And the institutional means that in order to organize large networks, large scales of cooperation, we have created institutions. These institutions are, of course, serve a certain number of functions. They have organic justification, but they are also very important in symbolic terms. We refer to these institutions, tangible and intangible. When I say intangible, a nation is an institution, but it's an intangible institution. These institutions are very important to give us sense of belonging. And some of these institutions are complete inventions. Nations, for example, are based only in belief. And some others are tools that sooner or later will become obsolescent. And so we will need to get rid of them in order to keep on living in a sustainable way. And in this second case, we could consider all the other institutions, including, I like always to give this example, the universities. There will come a moment, I don't think we have gotten there yet, but there will come a moment when universities will no longer be needed. And when I say universities, I say restaurants, cafeterias, hospitals, everything that we take for fundamental and irreplaceable. There will be a time when it will need to be replaced by something else. But nevertheless, while they exist, they shape the way we understand, we organize, and we master the world. And so this third dimension is very important, not only in functional terms, but in, as I said, symbolic terms. And finally, there is an ecological dimension, which is how we relate to everything else, to the biotic dimension, but everything else in the planet. There is a logic in life, which is a trend towards equilibrium, a homeostatic process. Antonio Damasio, who spoke in the European Humanities Conference earlier this month, spoke about it, and I will give you in the end the online reference if you wish to listen to his remarkable speech. There is a tendency for a certain level of equilibrium, which comes from biology. It can be understood or perceived in things as simple as the temperature of our body. We all know that it has to sit around 36.5 Celsius. If it goes too low or too high, we will get sick and eventually we will die. And this goes on and on for everything that relates to us and everything that relates to the world. So this fourth dimension is very important. And often today we discuss on this fourth dimension, but we also forget about the systemic integration with the other three. And it is not possible to deal with the homeostatic process if you don't consider the economic, social, and institutional drivers. Because if you do, you forget that they are the core components through which humans address precisely this equilibrium need. Because human agency does not proceed from the environment constraints, but from the perception of those constraints. And this is a fundamental difference. This is where we go into the notion of adaptation. Now, in adaptation, we talk about very different things. Let's start first with the notion of the vital nexus. We know from biology, from anthropology, physical anthropology, that there is a crucial minimum number of individuals that should be in relation to each one of us. Some experts talk about 450, but this number can go a little bit or go a little bit down. But nevertheless, there is a minimum number of humans with whom we must be in contact for various purposes. And this tends to grow. This crucial minimum network tends to grow. And when it grows, this minimal number, when we look at past societies in Paleolithic times, they might have most of the times less than 100 individuals. But nevertheless, the different groups would meet in some occasions for exchanging products and even people, even marriages or whatever you want to call matchmaking relations among the groups, so that the genetic diversity would be kept and the species would continue existing. But when the group starts growing, there are two dimensions that are very important. One is that the immediate first consequence is disorganization. When you have a group with 3, 4 people, 5 people, a family, there are often tensions, but they are manageable. If you have a group of 30 to 40 people, you can still manage. You start requiring a little bit of stronger hierarchy, but it's still manageable. But if you get a group of 400, 500, 600, it starts becoming much more complicated because subgroups tend to structure themselves and disputes start being organized. The organization of the disputes is actually not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's the way the group can keep on growing. If it doesn't, there will be no organized disputes. There will be only individual disparate strategies, and this will lead to a complete chaos. So we have these two tendencies, and we have them today. One side observation about this. The strategy of public policies for the last 70 to 80 years has been to concentrate people in big cities. In urbanism, for example, and in environmental studies, it has been considered that the human's impact on the planet would be lesser if people would occupy smaller parts of the land in big cities, which would allow to save energy in terms of infrastructures, and on the other hand, would protect the rest of the planet, which would become inhabited, and therefore the nature could progress freely. We are observing exactly the opposite. We are observing that except for some reserves that are kept with strong investments, the abandoned, the depopulated areas are among those that have suffered more in terms of the environmental destructions. And on the other hand, we have a growing pattern of conflicts and violence within the cities. But this is something we understand in anthropology in terms of the relations among humans. Concentration of humans is never an easy thing, and a larger concentration of humans will require stronger organization, which means stronger institutions, and this means ultimately stronger repression, hierarchy and repression. This relates to, there are two important concepts, assimilation and accommodation in the adaptation process. The assimilation is when we integrate contextual changes into the same behavior strategies. When there is a change in the context, for example, global warming, we need to adapt, we need to change something. Now, one first reaction in face of this or anything else in our lives, if, for example, we lose our job, or if someone in the family passes away, this is always disruptive for our lives, individual lives and collective lives. So we need to adapt. One first thing we will try to do is to integrate that and keep on living as before. For example, we put on weight and we try to eat less. We see that there is more pollution, we try to mitigate the impacts of that pollution. For example, today in many parts of the world, we talk about the Green Deal. It started in the United States, it keeps on going in Europe, and I believe this will be a planetary trend. But what is behind this planetary trend, which I'm not disputing? I'm not saying that the Green Deal is bad, but I'm saying that the mindset behind this is the assimilation mechanism. Like in face of the pandemic, the dominant discourse is we will get our lives back. We will go back to what we had 2 years ago. It's a matter of time. The vaccine or whatever will, or the pandemic will go away. In one way or another, we will resume the life as it was, which is quite funny because most people were complaining about their lives 2 years ago. And so it is an interesting process that humans have. It's not the first time. As I said, we have it at the individual and the collective way, which is in face of a disruptive event, we try to move back. The problem is that this is never a good strategy, or almost never a good strategy, because when the events are really disruptive, we can't go back. This is the point. And this is when other concepts become important. The concept of innovation, which is not inventing things. It's about socializing new ideas and new technologies, new tools into community strategies. So it's not the invention of ceramics or of metal that has done anything very significant in our remote past. It was the moment when slightly later, the majority of societies decided to use those technologies. The same goes, for example, for the invention of steam, which occurred much earlier than the moment when it became socialized. It became socialized, widely used in the second half of the 19th century only. Or the digital changes, which are now dominating from the 1990s. We can say that the digital technologies entered the domestic space, and so they became part of our lives at home. They existed already for some decades, but they were restricted to some structures and institutions. So the innovation is very important because it's the moment when the majority of the society, not because of a law, not because of an imposition, but because of a global convergent understanding, thinks that some issue, idea, tool that has been invented before makes sense to be used from that moment on. And when you use innovations, when you change the way you do things, of course, you are no longer in the strategy of assimilation. You are into the strategy of accommodation. Accommodation is to adjust the behavior strategies through innovation, and it means that you do something completely different. For example, we have examples of that today in the world. That's what migrants do. They don't try to keep, for example, in the migrants in the Mediterranean that come to the shores of Europe. They try to keep on living miserably in Central Asia or in deserted areas of Northern Africa. They move away from the world as they know it, and they decide to take the chance somewhere else, knowing that they may die in the process. Because any migrant knows when they go in boats and so on, sailing and trying to find a better life, they know they can die. But that's what accommodation is about. It's when you realize that the way you were living is no longer sustainable. You need to try to do something, otherwise you will only be sitting waiting for a major disaster. And when this happens, it starts normally as a technical choice, as you are put against the wall. So you really try to do something because you understand that assimilation is no longer sufficient. But then there will be eventually a moment when there is a real transformation. And when we use the concept transformation, I'm talking about mindset transition. That's when you start thinking that living in a different way, it's not only possible, but even better, even a new way of facing the future. And that's what happened, for example, when medieval societies in Europe decided to embrace modernity. To give you an example, there is a moment when you say, okay, it's no longer about trying to save myself and my family. It's about, for all of us, to live in a completely different way. As you know, we discuss today in our society, we mix these various concepts: climate, environment, adaptation, transformation, and they are different. They have different time scales. They relate differently to perceptions. They have different dimensions in the role of human perceptions and of the narratives we can build about ourselves and about what's happening around us. So I won't discuss this slide because I've basically talked about it, but in the bottom, I would stress this important dimension.
if you have a society that is put against the wall in terms of contextual transformations, inventions and creativity will always be very important, but let's not forget they are only preconditions, because it is possible in face of inventions and creativity to use the basic mechanisms of resistance, because assimilation is largely about resisting to change. Assimilation is largely to say, I might have a difficult life, but I don't want to risk trying something else, because trying something else can bring death. So it's not a stupid choice. It's not a stupid approach. It's simply actually very intelligent approach. The dramatic problem is that sometimes it doesn't work. It works in many cases. We assimilate most of the things that we don't like. We assimilate. We have a colleague who is not a very nice person, but we cope with that and we keep on doing our lives. We have friends and sometimes we break apart and we get sad, but we incorporate those issues. As I said, we can even have dramatic processes like friends and family passing away, but except for those who fall into depression and become emotionally sick, in general, we move on. And all of that is assimilation. But sometimes assimilation is not sufficient. And then if we enter a process of transformation through innovation and transfer of knowledge into a new reality, then we have behavior transformation. Now let me tell you a few stories about innovation and about changes in the past. And here, let me say why I picked some of these moments. These are moments in the past of major transformations. We are a species which has, according to, well, it has over 2.5 million years of existence and 7 million years of preparation, if you wish, with some predecessors that are now extinct that led to what we are today. And until quite recent, we were divided into subspecies that populated different parts of the planet. Today, however, there is only one. There is only one species and one variant. If you want to talk about humans as we talk about viruses, there is only one variant in the world. That's the sapiens sapiens, or modern humans. It hasn't been all the time like this. We know that we evolved first in Africa, and we know we went out of Africa about at least 1.8 million years ago. That's when we find the first fossils, human fossils, out of Africa in Georgia, and also in a little bit later in Southeast Asia. And this is, of course, a very important moment. The moment when humans made, if you wish, their first transformative move. They took the first, or some of them took the first decisive choice of facing environmental, also climatic changes by moving away from the environments of Africa and going into the Near East, and then Asia, and Europe. This occurred in a moment we call the marine isotopic stage 63. I will probably go back to this in a minute, but nevertheless, let me explain why I've put those references there. In the history of humans, we have possibility of, or not of humans, of the planet. We have the possibility now with science to reconstruct the main climatic changes of the past. And we do that with a large number of sources of information, from fossil trees to speleothems, themes in caves. But one very important source of information, probably the most accurate, are deep sea cores that can be made in different parts of areas of the planet, in areas that still have glaciers, or in areas which have coral reefs and so on. So we have this information, and we know with a reasonable amount of certainty when the climate was colder or warmer. These marine isotopic stages are numbered from the current one. We are living in MIS1, which is a temperate, warm period. The immediate preceding one, slightly more than 10,000 years ago, was MIS2, and this was a cold glacial period. And it goes like this for all the rest of the time. The odd numbers indicate one type of climate, and the even numbers another type of climate. So 1, 3, 5, 7 are warm periods, 2, 4, 6, and then 62 or whatever are cold periods. So the first major migration occurred in a temperate moment, in a warm moment, and that's MIS 63. But immediately after this migration, not by the people who migrated, but originating from those who stood in Africa, those who remained in Africa, they invented the first bifaces and large cutting tools. You have an example of this in the screen. And this was a major intellectual revolution. It's the moment when the concept of symmetry is invented, and the idea that you can produce something to keep on having with you all the time. Until then, humans would use basic broken stones, and certainly also wooden sharp tools to do whatever they needed, but they would probably use those stones and bones and wood on a random way, not investing in producing more elaborate tools to take with them all the time. The invention of bifaces and large cutting tools is the invention of one object that serves different purposes, with a pointing edge to pierce, with a strong basis that you can use as an hammer, with cutting edges which allow you to take off the skin of hunted animals, for example. All this with just one tool. And then there is also a first idea of equilibrium of the shape of the tool, which is ergonomic on one hand, and you could even trace back the origins of our understanding of aesthetics here. It's interesting to notice that this happened among those who decided not to leave, those who decided to stay, but it's still an evidence of transformation. It's still an evidence that in face of the difficulties of moving into a different stage in terms of climatic and then the environmental immediate context, humans decided to change. They had to change. All of them changed. Some, as I said, doing migrating, others inventing new technologies. The second major migration out of Africa occurred around 600,000 years ago. And this was again in a moderate temperate period in terms of climate. It is the moment when the so-called Homo heidelbergensis arrive in Europe. And when they arrive in Europe, they will bring with them the technology of bifaces, which arrives here much later than in Africa. Another important step in terms of the growing complexity of human behavior was the domestication of fire. Domestication of fire, the capacity to not only to use fire, which of course was used for a much longer time, but to actually make it, producing hearts, and there, among other things, being able to cook the food and change the patterns of digestion and the type of energy that you need to use in order or food you need to use in order to put back the energy you need to stay alive. This changed around 400,000 years ago for the first time in Europe. You see the photo on the screen of the first oldest heart we know, which is in Terra Mata in southern France. And this was again in a temperate, warm period. The third and last major migration out of Africa in terms of new species started actually earlier, but became massive, if you want, around 120,000 years ago. And that's MIS5. It's again very unstable, but tendentially warmer period. And it would be also in a moderate period that the first art and complex tools, bow, arrow, harpoons, and so on, were invented and widely used in Europe. And I'm saying this because I'm trying to bring to you one first idea, which is in the past, in the remote past of the glacial periods, major transformations occurred not in the cold periods when people privileged the assimilation mechanism, but in the warm periods when people actually made changes, entered the path of adaptation and global transformation. Now, when we move into MIS1, which is when we are living, let's see what, here we have more information. So I have these graphics which indicate the oscillations of temperature for the last 10,000 years. The blue curve is a curve that relates to the glacial areas. So they are not so important for us because not so many people were living there. But the other curve, which is violet, and it's indicated as being GISP2. GISP2 is one of the sea cores, the deep sea cores, where these climatic reconstructions are made from. And you can see that very important changes occurred in what we call the Holocene, which is the period we are living. Certainly, first big villages, the origins of cities. We know that concentrations, we know that sedentism is actually a practice that goes back for several millennia, still under during the Paleolithic times, still before the Holocene. But the concentration of people in villages starts happening for the first time in the early Holocene. When? Well, around 8.2 thousand years ago, before Christ, so roughly 10,000 years ago. And this happens because the environment at the time was much warmer than today, leading to a tremendous biotic productivity. The beginning of the Holocene is dramatic for the humans living at the time, because all the species that were used to hunt in the northern hemisphere basically died out or migrated north. I'm talking about big horses, big bovines, the aurochs, and so on. This type of fauna disappeared. But on the other hand, the human group started to see a proliferation of small animals in large quantities. They also saw the development of vegetation, cereals, other vegetables that allowed a quality of life, if you wish, and an accessibility to food which was unprecedented. And for that reason, these groups, particularly in the areas which were richer in terms of this productivity, in the Near East, for example, but also in some areas in Southeast Asia, they started to become sedentary again. But for the first time, their demography grew very fast. And so this happened when? This started happening in the warm period. It's what it's called the climatic optimum, the warmest period ever in the Holocene, something between 8,000 and 4,500 BC. And you see this as number one in the graph. As you see that number 3 in the graph is also the moment of a moment of warm. It's actually the peak. 3 and 4a are the peaks of the warmest moments in the Holocene. They also relate to major climatic dramatic changes, because what is important for humans is not that much if it's cold or if it's warm. It's if it has changed or not dramatically in relation to the recent past. When you take number 1, for example, in the graph, you see that immediately before, the weather was very, very cold because it was the glacial period. So this was dramatic. When you take number 2, for example, it's also dramatic because it used to be very warm and suddenly occurred what we call a climatic oscillation. It's a change, but it's not a complete change. It's an oscillation. The oscillations can last a few centuries sometimes, and they can be relatively fast. And when you see these sharp ups and downs, it means that oscillation was very fast, was in the scale of a few years, a few decades. So something that people could experience, at least even if their life expectancy was very small, and therefore they would not necessarily experience all the change, completely understand the change. But remember, we are talking at this time of societies without writing systems, where all the knowledge was conveyed through songs, through tales, through oral histories. And these oral histories would, of course, relate to the environment as they knew it. And so one of the dramatic aspects when climate changes like this for these traditional societies is that suddenly there is a complete disagreement between their tales, their memories, their histories, their sense of belonging, and what they see. What they see starts to be completely different. And so you see that the first attempts of economic intensification, which means producing food, start in a cold moment, a relatively cold moment. Why is this? It's strange because it never happened before in history, and there have been other warm periods. The explanation is probably because the weather being warmer already in the first phase and with lots of resources, human groups became very big. Villages, for the first time, as I said, were already around there for over 1,000 years. And one thing is to move a group of 50 or 60 or 100 individuals. Another thing is to move a group of several hundreds, 1,000, 2,000 individuals. Then we are talking about groups with lots of children, lots of old people, lots of pregnant women. So it becomes impossible to move them all. So for the first time, there was this choice by many of the groups, not all, but many of the groups. What if we start producing food in trying to match what nature is no longer doing by itself? Because whenever you get a colder or warmer period, you also get a dehydration process. You start getting less humidity. And the most serious thing for life is not temperature, it's humidity. If we lose humidity, we lose life. And we start by losing vegetation. And then if we lose vegetation, we also lose animals. And if animals are lost, humans being animals, this is not good news. So the beginnings of the experimentation of doing this intensification through the domestication of plants, which already was there slightly before, but this is the moment when it starts spreading. We also see, in this slide, I came with some other moments, the beginnings of copper and lead metallurgy, their invention, if you wish. The expansion of farming, which becomes completely dominant in terms of the Mediterranean and Southern Europe and Northern Africa around 5,500, 5,600 years before Christ, so 7,500 years ago. Also, the expansion of metallurgy, of metals, the widespread use of metals. And this was some 6,000 years ago. And so all these elements occur in moments of warm tendencies. Numbers 6 and number 7 relate to cold periods. And now you see something which is not so nice. In a sense, you can say the choice of intensification, number 2, was already an aggressive strategy. This strategy of intensification is an aggression to the ecosystem. The first big destruction of biodiversity was made by farmers. Farming is the strongest, or has had the strongest impact in terms of the coverage of the planet. But then, once you have done that, in subsequent moments, when you get into a low natural productivity, when you lose food, in basic simple terms, every time you get a colder period or a warmer period, you lose food, but you lose more if it's cold. And 6 stands for the first documented important conflicts in Southern Europe, and 7 for the first wars. 7 stands for the beginning of what some prehistorians called barbarian Europe, in the sense of the barbars, as the Romans would call them later. It's the beginning of kingdoms. It's the beginning of ranked societies with a very sharp social inequality. And all these trends occurred in moments of cold weather. And what about the civilizations? Well, there is a moment when you start getting a more complex set of societies with a very strong inequality, but you start also to reflect on that inequality, and you start thinking that maybe another path should be chosen. I'm bringing you again just a few examples. Number 1 is the climax of Greek civilization the so-called Pericles century, which was a warm period. It didn't end well because, well, it ended with a plague, the Athenian plague, which killed Pericles himself. But it was a very important moment, the highest moment of the Greek civilization. Number 3, it's the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is the most important civilization in classical times in the western part of the world. And it relates to a warm period. A warm period, by the way, climatologists called it the Roman warm period. So if you want to think about the good days of the Roman Empire, which were not so good for slaves, but they were good in other dimensions, you have to think of warm weather, warmer than today, once again. And if you look at number 6, this is the beginning of the medieval warm period, when after a sequence of cold climate, there was a very important warming sequence of about 4 to 5 centuries, with the melting of glaciers in Greenland, for example, and the colonization of Greenland by Vikings, who had to leave a few centuries later when the glacier reconstructed itself. It's also the so-called medieval Renaissance period with the reorganization of cities, of trade. It is the moment when universities are founded. It's also the moment when major agricultural reorganization is made and new strategies of land management emerge. And again, you will see this. You see this in a very short period of warm weather, which is, although within a cold period, which is number 7, with the spread of Renaissance. Renaissance started earlier in Italy, but it spreads across Europe around in the beginning of the 16th century, and this is in a limited warming stage. On the other hand, we have a certain number of examples of what happened when you have peaks going down very fast. Number 2, it's the Punic Wars. We know that the Romans won these wars, but I'm trying to stress here that after a warm period, the wars, not the conflicts, not the tensions were there already for some centuries, but suddenly they lead to war. And that's when Carthago and Rome dispute. In the end, Rome will win. You have the painting on the bottom of the slide stands for one of these battles where you can see elephants from Northern Africa fighting in the north of Italy, because the Carthaginian civilization was an exquisite civilization. They might have won, actually, the wars against Rome, and they have a tremendous capacity in terms of resources. But what is important here for my argument is that war is erupted in a moment like this. The beginning of the decay of the Roman Empire, number 4, it's also going along the sharp ends of the Roman warm period. The expansion, and this is particularly interesting, the expansion of the Arab civilization in the 7th century relates to a sharp cold drop in temperatures for a cold weather, associated to a very fast decrease of natural productivity and desertification. And it's interesting because in a moment like that, most societies were incapable of facing. They were used to have a city's model of life based on trade, based on long distance exchanges, and suddenly all this collapses. And to the fortune, actually, of the Mediterranean world, the Arabs were used to have an environment, a deserted environment. They knew how to live in those conditions. So the expansion, the Arabs' expansion, is not simply a conquest. It's an adaptation process through which societies throughout the Mediterranean learn with the Arabs how to keep on living, how to survive. And by the way, this period between the 7th and the 9th century is not only a moment of desertification and cold weather, it is also a moment of plague. It's the Justinian plague that lasted for 200 years. And so it's an interesting process. And then the French Revolution, just to give you a very close example, not the disputes, not the divergences between bourgeoisie and monarchists and so on, but the revolution, the war, was preceded by 3 years without summer in Europe. It was a very cold moment, which was aggravated by the eruption of a volcano with 3 years without sunlight. And this destroyed the crops, produced tremendous starvation, and led to this major conflict, which is important for the lives of us all in the planet, as we know. I have to accelerate because I see I'm using my time, but anyway, I said this would be the longest part of my talk. I'm not an expert in Asian context, so, but I wanted to bring some examples closer to you. I'm sorry, I don't have data enough to go to the Great China world in these topics, but I brought you in any case Central Asia and Mongolia. And here you have some interesting data as well. For example, well, let me say the curve on the top relates to Mongolian data, and the curve on the bottom relates to Central Asia. And this is already important because these are not temperature curves, are humidity curves. And you see that the humidity percentage in Mongolia and Central Asia are not exactly the same. This is, I wanted to bring you this example also to say, when we talk about climate change, we talk a lot about temperature, we talk very little about humidity, which I already explained, it's much more important for us and other species. And then when we talk about humidity, the variation along the planet is much greater. And so it is much more this that we have to look at. And when we talk about humidity, the distance to sea, for example, the existence or not of rivers around, and also the height, the elevation are important variables, as we all know. Now, in the end of the Arab cycle in the Mediterranean and the Near East and Central Asia, the Persian world starts, the Iranian world starts to become the big stronghold in civilization terms for all this region. And one important empire, the Samanid Empire, was ruling by the end of the first millennium after Christ. So roughly 1,000 years, 900 to 1,000 years, 1100 to 1,000 years ago. And the decay of the Samanid Empire, which is a very important moment, as we all know, for all this region with Iranian influence that goes across Central Asia, can be traced back to a significant drop in humidity, as you can see in the slide. And you can also see that the Khwarezmian dynasty, which is probably the last big civilization empire related to this Persian world, will last for a period which is a period of increase in humidity. And again, please remember that for humans, as for life in general, it's never the number, the percentage of humidity that is important, it's the change. And so if you are coming from a moment of drought and suddenly you get more moisture, more water through rain or whatever, then the quality of your life will improve very fast. So the Khwarezmian dynasty benefited from that. Now look at number 3. Number 3, it's very interesting because in number 3, you have an increase of humidity in Mongolia and the decrease of humidity in Central Asia. And this is Genghis Khan. This is the first Mongolian big expansion. And you see how important food is always for all this past historical process. The same way you will see that number 4, the first fragmentation of the Mongolian Empire, corresponds to a collapse in terms of humidity in Mongolia. Also in Central Asia, but it doesn't matter. The problem is that if you have a center that suddenly lacks its basis to keep on moving, then of course it lacks strength to keep the empire running. The Timur or Tamerlan Empire will emerge again in a moment of increase of humidity. And the rule of the Qing dynasty over Mongolia and Central Asia will come precisely when there will be a decrease in humidity in these regions. I must say that I don't know what was the humidity in China at the time, but it would not be that important because by then China was a very powerful and big empire with a tremendously complex internal trade economy. And one of the advantages in terms of sustainability of a global economy, as China was already at the time, is that it can go along with climatic changes without major disruptions. But of course, Qing benefited from the decay in terms of humidity in these two regions at the time. So the general observations is that major transformations occur apparently in moments of climatic shift, that there is a tendency for stronger innovation under warming trends. This is the good news I wanted to bring you, because there is a tendency for stronger violence and decay under cooling trends. And we are in a warming trend. So this is the good news in a moment where we basically have bad news. And we can say that apparently the cycles in terms of human performance are a moment of equilibrium, then warming, then with warming, the growth of human societies, then cooling, then entropy, disorganization, collapse, and then equilibrium again, and the cycle starts again. And for the last few years, we've been talking about this great acceleration because scientists, first in the environmental world, in the Earth system studies, and then also in social and economic studies, in social sciences, started to build these graphics, as you can see here, and identify what they perceived as a major transformation, change, contextual change, and argued that these were characterized by two important things. One is that all the trends in environmental and social aspects, socioeconomic aspects, seem to change at the same time, or more or less at the same time, and with a tremendous speed. So very, very, very fast. And using the argument that this is the first time it happens in the, ever. Well, these graphics are completely accurate. there is an acceleration, and this acceleration encompasses both atmospheric and fresh water and other similar indicators in terms of the ecosystems, and also in terms of water use and GDP and other indicators like traveling, tourism, and so on. Everything accelerated. Some authors dispute, did this happen after 1950, or did it start 150 years ago, or was it more after the 1990s? But nevertheless, this is the basic picture. And the picture itself is correct. But what is incorrect is to say it's the first time. Both the climatic optimum and the medieval warm period experience warm moments which were warmer than today. And in many moments of the past, there were accelerations, both in the direction of warm oscillations. For example, about 8,200 years ago, when there was a strong warming acceleration, and also in cooling trends. Also, the end of the Middle Ages in Europe corresponds to a moment of abrupt decay of temperatures and humidity and the collapse in agriculture. And I also mentioned to you the case of the French Revolution in the 18th century. So I think I don't have time to go, and you wouldn't be that interested in talking about this in detail, but in any way, let's go back for a second to climate. When we talk about climate and oscillations in climate, there is, we see, for example, today that glaciers are melting, and this is not good or bad news, it's simply news. And these are news that say life cannot keep on being as it was. And what is the primary controller of weather, more even than climate, of weather, is the so-called thermoline circulation, which is what you see here with these red lines, which are flows of warm water that form particularly in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and then they go up through the Atlantic and eventually closer to the Northern Pole. They will be cooled, and they will become cold water and go deeper into the ocean and dive, if you wish, and then keep on the circulation like this. It's because we have now a flow of water that is called the Gulf Stream that brings warm water and with it warm weather into the Northern Hemisphere, that we have the world as we have it, and we have a temperate situation. And everyone is talking about global warming and how we have to face a continuous warming for the next few decades. Now, what we don't see in the discussions, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, I'm only saying what we should also be discussing, is that if major icebergs are released from Antarctica, there is a high possibility that they will cool off and stop the Gulf Stream. We already know that the Gulf Stream is now slower than it was 40 years ago. And being slower is already creating a more unbalanced weather in the Northern Hemisphere. But if the current stops, we will have the beginning of a small glaciation, because it's not only humans and human behavior that follow the rules of homeostasis, the planet does. So if there is a too much warming, it will be succeeded by a cooling process. And again, it's not the first time. Remember, I told you that the medieval warm period, which was a great period in terms of culture and civilization, led to a cooling process. Now, how do we call this cooled cold period. We call it the Little Ice Age, and it lasted until around 860, so not long ago. Some climatologists, I know they are a minority, but among them, a large number of those who do quaternary science, that those who recognize the warming of the current global warming should understand that this warming relates to the end of the Little Ice Age. And so we are, in fact, in a 150 cycle year of warming. But this is the normal process of warming related to the evolution of climates throughout the Holocene. And in that case, we should also understand that humans are not necessarily a major agent in this change. I'm not saying that it's good to have CO2 gas emissions and so on. I'm only saying that even if we stop doing that, the weather will keep on warming because this is the trend. And so we should have strategies to start adapting to live under warm circumstances and not only to prevent warming. We are having an acceleration, yes, but it is another great acceleration. We've had it in the past. And we see that this time, apparently we are focusing in the short-term problems. We think technology will solve them. And in the end, we refuse, the majority of our societies refuse to adapt. They refuse to change their way. And we have seen it, particularly in institutional responses to the pandemic, through which all the governments, or at least the large majority of governments, including those who had what I would like to say a better approach in terms of recognizing the seriousness of the pandemic, or the others who had a little bit absurd discourses negating the existence of the disease. But all of them talk about technical solutions to go back to the life we had. At the same time, we see in the world a rising failure of the optimism that existed before, a growing skepticism, and a growing nihilism, which are dangerous trends, particularly in a moment when we are, for the first time, called to become human. We are a human species, of course, but never in the past we needed to act as humans. We could act as Portuguese, as Chinese, French, whatever you want to call it. We had the possibility to design strategies which were basically ethnocentric strategies. For the first time, we have to act as a one. We have to face it globally in a convergent way, respecting our differences. But the dominant discourse is about the need to stress our diversity and to fight against anthropocentric approaches. And now, of course, I don't like anthropocentric approaches. I think they are wrong. But on the other hand, life and public discourse is not about absolute scientific beliefs. It's also about perception and about homeostasis and balances. Diversity is not only a major need for humans, it's our major capacity of adaptation. It's because we are diverse that we find different strategies and then we can survive. But now that we need to have not a unique strategy, but a convergent strategy, the only way to mobilize people across the world to do that is to recognize we are one species. And this will entail necessarily a wrong but needed anthropocentric approach. But the anthropocentric approach, if it's intellectually clever, will not destroy the environment. It's exactly the opposite. Ethnocentric approaches that privilege diversity over the unity of the species, they are the ones who will tend to keep on having only assimilation strategy and therefore an aggressivity against the environment. I don't have time to go through this slide. I'm getting to the end of my time, but give me a few minutes more just to say some general things. I think that we have started a process which, in terms of human behavior, finds a moment of transition in the 1970s, when the world as it has been built after the Second World War started to change in practice. And one major change has been the financialization of economy worldwide. And it is this financial model that it's not so much sustainable if the economy needs to change in terms of the products it will distribute in the future. And if we want to keep an acceptable way of life, and if we want to prevent wars, I think we have to adapt. We have to change many things. We have to produce products that people actually need. And certainly the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are very nice, very important. I endorse them, but they are completely insufficient because they cannot be read as priorities the same way everywhere. And one important missing gap in the SDGs is what about all the rest? Because there is a strategy for cities, there is a strategy for inequality and so on, but there is no strategy for the planet where people don't live, the depopulated areas. But the reorganization of the life of humans on Earth requires to think of the planet as a global compound of ecosystems that are integrated. And so we need to think of the reorganization of territories based on values, and this is a different type of globalization. It's not the continuation of a globalization anchored only in finance, but it's also not stopping globalization, because stopping globalization would immediately produce starvation in large parts of the world. We have trends today in which we see dangerous things, ethnocentric memories being imposed over historical data, beliefs being put before knowledge and academic knowledge, the questioning of the common nature of humankind. Racism is an expression of that, but sometimes ethnocentric approaches are an expression of that as well. The redefinition of territories and identities is another trend. And the building of walls, which are, of course, walls to be put down, but these are trends that we have to face, that we are experiencing, and that are very dangerous. And getting to the end, I think we live moments of uncertainty. They are uncertain about the climate, but some things we know. We know there will be warming, and we also know, or we should know in academic terms, that if warming continues, we might even experience the beginning of new ice age or little ice age once again in our lifetime expectancy in this century. So we should have strategies for these two opposite situations. There is a consensus about the need to face extreme events because they are arriving fast, and risks and hazards are increasing. And so we may disagree if humans have a stronger or lesser responsibility in that. Take CO2, for example, and see the curve. Many people say that CO2 increase is directly the cause of warming. However, since 1980, and more even after 2000, CO2 keeps on increasing, but it's at a slower pace of temperature. If CO2 rise was the cause of temperature rise, this shouldn't be like this. But if we frame this into the long-term history of climate, we see that CO2 does contribute to warming, but it will not solve, the controlling of CO2 will not solve our problems in the next decades. So we may disagree on the causes, but as long as we agree on the reality that we are experiencing and the need to recognize ourselves as one species that needs to find a convergent path, then we should start discussing seriously about not if coastal areas can be preserved from sea level rise, but if frontiers should not be fought back in a way that humans can, in some cases, move into different territories without wars, in a different understanding of how life can keep on in this human life and other types of life can keep on existing in our planet. Of course, you may say this is impossible. It is not impossible. It will happen. One of the consequences of climate change every time in the past, every time, there's not one single exception, was the redesign of it. And so our choice is not to know if the frontiers will be redesigned or not. Our choice is if we will do it with or without wars. And I think humanities have an important contribution in this, because it is the way we shape the discussion, the way we build the narratives that can lead us to the type of debate that we need. And if we build a debate based on anxiety, on the notion of emergency, we will lose the sight that transformations take time. There is never a transformation if people are put under a tremendous pressure of anxiety. Normally, in those cases, there is rivalry, ethnocentrism, war, and decay. It is if we get the sense that we have time to change and that we need to change from today, but in a way that faces an uncertain future, not the set of certainties, false certainties that we are given, then we can contribute to a new reality. I don't have time for the last slides, but they are not so important in this discussion. Let me just bring to you the address. I will send I already sent actually the PowerPoint to the university so that you are free to share it. And here you have the documents of the European Humanities Conference earlier this month, which presents some tools, I believe, humanities-driven tools. It bridges a new UNESCO program, which builds on this need for convergence. And the Lisbon Declaration is about how universities could be and should restructure their teaching of science and humanities. And again, I think this is a contribution we should consider. I will stop now with this quotation of St. Augustine. There be three times: a present of things past, a present of things present, and a present of things future. Present of things past is memory, present of things present is sight, and present of things future is expectation. I like St. Augustine because he lived in the beginning of the Middle Ages. And he understood, although I'm not so fond of other ideas of his, but he understood that the way to build a better life for people in Europe and Northern Africa at the time would be to transform the behavior, to abandon this idea of trying to rebuild the Roman Empire. He lived in the 4th century and the Roman Empire was in a chaos and everyone was trying to reconstruct the empire. And he said, forget about it. It's no longer possible. And this is, I think, what we need to do today. Thank you. And sorry for having passed my time.
Thank you very much, Luiz, for this dense and very, at the same time, eye-opening and illuminating talk. I think it considerably reoriented our views on the the issues of problems of climate change. I think the very first moment when I heard you talk mention this, I was intrigued because you already back then, in 2017, indicated that actually global warming was not like what we have been talking about. And it's been, there were, interesting patterns that we have to pay attention to. And now today, you have very carefully and lucidly illustrated how, looked in the long term, we can have a, very, very different idea of what global warming might bring us and how, what kind of strategies we can begin to, to devise in order to cope with the current situation and in order to make us adapt to, whatever that might, whatever that might turn the world into. And so I guess we have invited, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, which was kind of impolite, because we co-organized this talk with the Department of Anthropology, which also has a tremendous number of faculty who works on archaeology. In fact, the department was used to be called Department of Archaeology. And so we've invited some of the faculties to also come online to ask questions directly or to share their ideas, opinions with you. Hello, do we have any of the faculty from the anthropology department yet? Qingyou. Hello.
We've contacted them, but we're still waiting for them to come online. So
okay,
maybe
okay. If not, if not, I'll start. I'll throw in some my own kind of very let's say amateur comments, not comments, maybe remarks or questions concerning some of the points in this talk. I mean, generally, I really, really enjoy this talk. There are just points that I guess maybe the audience needs elaboration. Okay. I think there seems to be, but it's not really a question. But maybe let me begin this by saying that this is just maybe kind of summary of what you've been talking about. I think people tend to, when they talk about climate change, they tend to, form, like you said, form the narrative on anxiety. And precisely because of that, we are not able to come up with strategies as a species. So because the kind of anxiety-driven debate tends to divide us rather than unify us. So your point is very well taken in the sense that we need to really reorganize our narrative concerning climate change. And it seems there's some kind of tension between between seemingly two positions you talk. One is that climate change is unavoidable. And the other point is that we need to innovate. We need to try to adapt to the situation, as well as to a certain extent transform the current situation. So people might find there's some kind of tension between these two, but basically I don't see there's a tension. But if you want, maybe you can elaborate on this a bit, to kind of relieve people of the anxiety over this tension between these two positions in your talk.
You mean the tension between the acknowledging the climate change and
right? On the one hand, it seems that what we need to do is adapt to the situation. To a certain extent, it's a kind of passive reaction. But on the other hand, it seems that you also alert us to the fact that we need to actively come up with strategies together as a species to cope with the situation. So
I understand.
On this point, it seems that we need to be more active, proactive. Yeah, but I mean, I see the middle ground there, but maybe the audience needs some kind of a elaboration or a stronger connect between these two.
Let me start by saying this. Today, in many cases, we can anticipate the eruption of a volcano. Not always, but in many cases we can. And when we know the behavior of the volcano, the normal behavior of the volcano, because volcanoes are areas which are very good in terms of the soils around for agriculture and so on. So people always like to live near volcanoes, but on the other hand, they're very dangerous. So people try to understand where the lava or whatever will go through and not build their houses and their basic structures in those areas and find areas and so on. One intelligent thing people do is that they don't think they can control the volcano. They learn to live with the volcano. The funny thing is that we all agree we can't control a volcano, but we think we can control the climate, which is much bigger than the volcano.
Right.
So it doesn't make any sense. For starters, it doesn't make any sense. Can we control a tsunami? No. So what should we do? Well, we should have a monitoring of the tsunamis, and this is being done. We should not live in areas too close to the dangerous areas near the volcano, and we should, even living there, avoid sitting too close, because if we can predict, then we need an escape strategy. But we have situations in the world where we forget about this. For example, Naples, an important city of Italy, sits on the base of a volcano which has erupted many times in the past and has killed thousands of people in the past. And never in the past so many people were living at the foot of the volcano. So this, what is happening in the area of Naples, it's not a good strategy in terms of adaptation. And what we are doing in terms of our strategies to face climate change is a little bit the same as people are doing in Naples. We are sitting in the base of the volcano, And we believe that we can control the volcano. In this case, that we can control the climate. It is, in a sense, strange. On the other hand, we could read it, and both of us, Sebastian, we are from humanities. So this is the origin of gods, of this idea. So people would call the volcano the god, and the ultimate expression of this belief is to say that we are the gods, like the emperor that becomes the god or whatever. And the discourse and the narrative, the dominant narrative about climate change is actually freezing us, because there is lots of movement, there is lots of actions, and there's lots of emergencies. But think that we had the 1972 summit on the climate, on the planet and on the climate. We had the 1992 summit. We had the 2012 summit also again in Rio de Janeiro. We have all sorts of agreements, the climate agreement, with endless number of agreements. And every year, the situation is worse. Every year, since the beginning of the 19th century. So my question is it because all the governments in the world are incompetent and they make agreements but they are incapable of implementing them? Are they all bandits that pretend to do something but then they do something else? Or are we having the wrong strategy? And I think we are having a wrong strategy, because it's no longer a 2 or 10 or 20 years. It's now a 50-year strategy. So for half a century, we've been working in a line, and every time it fails, we try to go deeper in the same line. But it's always the same discourse. And it's always, in the accent of the discourse is, we are the cause of the contextual changes. And I'm not saying that we don't play a role in it, because we do. But we are not the major agents. We are not God. And to be stronger than the Earth, to be stronger than atmospheric forces, to be stronger than the sun, we would need to be God. We are not. But the discourse that exists in a society that became largely an atheist society, again, this for humanities is very interesting, because we are living in the age that killed all the gods. But then it replaced them with the absolute belief in humans, making them gods. What I'm saying is, let's take it easy. We need to adapt. We have a problem in face of us. And if you see a volcano erupting, the worst thing is to believe that you can control the volcano. And if you start by thinking like this, then you can think, is it good to save water, for example? Yes, it's good to save water. We need water, and we are in shortage of fresh water, so we should invest in systems to do that. Do we need to change our behavior to prevent the expansion of diseases and reorganize the economy in that way? Yes. For example, one thing would be to distribute better the population across the planet instead of concentrating everyone into unmanageable huge cities where the quality of life is going down, but where also the needs of energy consumption is getting higher. For example, one incredible thing is that everyone says the use of fossil energy is a disaster. So we should change. That's correct. We all agree. What very few people would say, and you don't see it massively in the media and so on, is one, that for the next decades, fossil energy will keep on being used, and there is zero strategy to mitigate its impacts. Because all the strategies put in the renewable energy, and investment in renewable energy is good. I'm not saying it's not good. But where is the strategy to face the transition? Zero. Where is the highest consumption of fossil energy made? It's made in two things, in cities and in transportation. What is our strategy to get out of the pandemic and the crisis? Reinforce the cities and resume tourism as it existed. So, increase of CO2, increase of the same style of life. Is this
right?
Does it make any sense? Yeah. And I'm saying, am I against the tourism? No, I'm not against tourism. All I'm saying is this is an absurd level of discussion. And I think humanities can help framing things.
Thank you very much. I know we need to just become human again in order to save the world to a certain extent. Okay, we have actually quite a few faculty from the anthropology department now. We have Professor Chen, the chairman, Ma-Ling Chen, and we have Professor Cohen, and maybe Professor Jiang. So who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Professor Chen or Professor Cohen or Professor Jiang? Any of you?
I'm
Cohen,
David.
maybe.
Yeah. Can you see and hear me, first of all?
We can.
Okay, good. I'm adjusting to WebEx. This is the first time I've opened it. So I'm trying to balance a few things here at the same time. First of all, thank you very much for coming to us all the way from Portugal for your talk. I assume that's where you are now. I enjoyed it very much. It actually overlaps with many of my own research areas, which have to do with the Paleolithic to Neolithic transition in China. And of course, climate change and many of the issues you talked about in human evolution relate directly to what I do. In a broader sense, what's interesting about your talk is something that we as archaeologists always battle with, and that is, how does our own work relate to the present day needs of society? So it goes to justifying the types of research we do and how applicable they are to modern world problems. So thank you for giving me some ideas on that front as well. I noticed in your talk and in seeing your sort of skepticism about human action today in alleviating the effects of climate change, you also didn't really talk about the concept of the Anthropocene. Is that something that you're consciously avoiding doing because you don't necessarily agree with the movements that concept is pushing various fields into?
Thank you for this very important question, David, because yes, absolutely, I disagree with the concept. And to be very blunt, I would say that a few years ago, geologists agreed that the concept of Anthropozoic was wrong. As you know, we used to, both you and me, we have learned that there were 4 ages and 4 eras, and the Anthropozoic was the last one, the Quaternary, and the Quaternary now is a stage in the Cenozoic. And the basic argument was, we cannot define a geological era with only 2.5 or 2.4 million years, and to consider this the era of the humans is an anthropocentric approach. And so geologically, it's wrong. Scientifically, it's wrong. And then a few years later, we have replaced that with the Anthropocene. So now we apparently we can. I see this as this anthropocentric need of humans to think of themselves always at the center, either inventing gods to our resemble to us or whatever. And it is, I think, a wrong but also dangerous concept, because precisely it puts us again in the top of the chain. It's a new version of man, the king of the animals. And I think the way to move out of the difficulties we are experiencing in terms of climate change, because I do think there is a climate oscillation and we have environmental consequences of that, is to start by understanding that we are only one species with particular capacities, including destructive capacities, but not to the point of changing the climate. And we have seen that with the pandemic, because in the beginning of the pandemic and the first big confinement, which was made almost everywhere in the planet, after 3 weeks, the levels of pollution went down. Now, we should remember that 2 years ago, many people would say that even if we stopped all the economy, it would take 500 years to resume the situation as before. But it didn't. It took 3 weeks. So the point is not the climate. We are not affecting the climate. We are simply destroying our habitat, which is important. And destroying our habitat, we are also destroying the habitat of many other species. We are killing and destroying many species. This is absolutely true. And in destroying biotic chains, we create problems which in the end will have some impact in the climate, yes, but very limited. It's not a big issue, I think. So I don't use the concept of influence.
Okay. How about Professor Chen Maling, 教授? Would you like to say something? Or Professor Jiang?
Actually,
either.
Yeah. Actually, I have a question. Thank you very much for your talk. And it's very nice that you try to correlate different climate change or environment events with the human history. Lots of big human events happened in the human history. But I agree with you that we should, as a human beings, as Homo sapiens sapiens, we should be humble. We are just part of this big system. But at the same time, I'm also a little bit worried or a little bit.
Hello?
I think I lost Professor Chang.
Is that Professor Jiang or Professor Chen? Hello?
I think we lost her.
Yeah, we lost her. She's a bit worried, but
She's coming
Professor
back.
Jiang, okay. Professor Jiang. Well, let's wait. Maybe while we're waiting, Professor Chen Maling 教授, would you like to say something? Professor Jiang is back. Yeah, Professor Jiang, yeah, continue, please. 张老师.
I think the band is.
Yeah, connection is not good, huh? Then how about Professor Chen? Would you like to say something?
Or maybe Professor Chang can write in the chat, because that.
Sorry for that.
Professor
Sorry for that, because my connection has some problem. And just thank you for your talk.
The chairman of the department.
Thank you for your talk, but there has something come up, and I deal with that, so I didn't have a whole the picture of the talk. So sorry for that.
I think their connections are not very good.
Too bad.
Yes.
How about Professor Huang? Or David, would you like to continue? Do you have any other remarks, comments?
Well, yeah. After your the sort of skepticism about treating climate change as the issue because it's sort of beyond human control, I'm sure a lot of various politicians and scientists might not agree with that statement exactly, but I think I get your point. And it's sort of like what politicians would say, where all politics are local politics. So you can have these broad, worldwide, national, international issues, but that's not really what matters. And I guess the point here is that climate change and how humans can affect it in a positive way is actually things at the local level. So it's not climate, it's like you mentioned, it's environment and ecological systems and things like that. So that's an interesting way of changing points of view about it too, and it actually shifts the idea of how archaeologists look at the climate record too. And in fact, all of our views are very, very localized views. And when we see human impact, it's only very local impact that we see. That's just the nature of archaeological data. And you can bring in the ice core records and everything else at a broader scale, but when we're looking at human action, human activity, and trying to translate that to human action today, we can only see things at an incredibly localized scale, the excavation area of our sites, in fact.
Yes, you are absolutely right, David. And I think when I brought this very general correlation between historical events and climate, of course, I know that the variations existed in those moments. So if we wanted to go into greater detail, situations would be much more complex. But I try to do for the past what is done for the present. And so there are scales where you can consider things. And this was largely to bring actually also a positive message. The positive message being that in warming periods, there are more examples. I'm not saying it was always like this, but there are more examples of humans having found sustainable strategies for the future. Whereas in colder periods, it's very rare. It also occurs, but it's more rare. We can understand that. Now, also in psychological terms and so on. The point is, for me, that I'm not a negationist. I think there is a climate change and that this affects the whole globe. But on the other hand, it affects each place in a different way, as you exactly said. And I think archaeology has a good contribution. Because what I think is we need to, all of us need to change, but we need to change in different ways. And sometimes I see the discourse about sustainability as a bit authoritarian, like you have to do like this. Now, the needs for a community in Southern Africa are not, and the pressures, including the environmental pressures, are not the same as in Taiwan or in Lisbon. And so you will never, you can get the support of people for the idea, but you will never get a real mobilization towards building something. You can create a mobilization to go against something, but not to build something. And the reason why I think we need a convergence strategy is because we need local transition programs, but we have a global economy. And if we only have local solutions, let's say, this global economy will be disrupted. If it is disrupted, there will be a transition moment where most people, or at least a large part of the population in the world, which is now too much dependent on long distance exchanges, will fall into misery. So we need a balance, and it's the first time we need it at this scale. If we will not find that, we will collapse as a global system. And every time in the past that global systems collapsed, and all the global systems of the past have collapsed, we know that in the end, many people suffered from it. So sooner or later, there will be an equilibrium. And I also think that one thing that I mentioned in the end is this Bridges program. We've been working on this actually on the contribution of archaeology for sustainability and landscape management for the last 20 years. And UNESCO just approved the 31st of March a new program called Bridges, which is based on a document approved in 2017 by the General Assembly of UNESCO on Sustainability Science. It is the first program that considers humanities to be to calls on humanities to lead the process of sustainability. And the way it defends that is that through building site-based projects, which is very close to what we do in archaeology. Understanding that as we are now in a web of sites, and the sites are not, the places are not isolated. If we build site-based strategies, we will mobilize people, and on the other hand, we will find convergent actions. That's basically it.
Great. Any other questions or comments from either the friends from the anthropology department or from the audience, from the YouTube? No questions from YouTube. Okay. So maybe a last comment or question.
Hi.
Yeah?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Professor Jiang.
This is Zhihua Jiang. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I need to turn off my video so that the connection won't be off. So yeah. I'm sorry that we cannot see face to face. And I think I'm kind of following David's questions, and it's more like right now there are a lot of different places that the indigenous population, their way of facing the climate change is totally different, or the way that they face the world is different from ours. And then the examples you gave us, that I totally agree with you that as human beings of Homo sapiens sapiens, we are part of the bigger system. We're not that unique, and then we have to adapt to the environment in certain points. But the examples that you gave us is actually quite limited to more what we call the so-called big civilization type of example. But if we look at the different indigenous populations, they actually have different attitudes or different ways of managing the environment. And then it actually can help us to face the climate issues, the climate problems that we face today. And so, but the way that I'm a little bit worried that these bigger pictures, these big events associated with this big climate events will actually minimize or underestimate the power of the indigenous knowledge in some way. So
thank you. I think yes, please.
No. I think that's my question.
Okay, thank you. I think again it's a very important question, and I would fully agree with you that we have underestimated the knowledge of several communities, which I think tell us two basic things. One common element of all these traditional societies that still exist is that they have a different perception of what the environment and the planet is. They think of themselves not as the top of the chain, but as part of the ecosystem. This is very important. So there is a continuum between them and the rest. And then they have different understandings, they have different strategies because they are context-based, but they try to preserve the ecosystem as much as possible as it is, because this is the way they know how to live and so on. And I think we have a lot to learn. But one important aspect is all these communities are of low demography. And of course, their strategies are largely dependent on that. It's not possible to use that sort of knowledge. I wouldn't like to call it models, but in brackets, that model of approach and understanding of life and ecosystems, if you are in a model of society which is based in big urban centers. Because you cannot build a mindset which is connected to nature when all you see is buildings and cars and pollution. So I'm of those who think that probably in the future a desirable and also technically possible thing to do is actually to disperse people, to diminish the concentration of population. And I think that would be a wise decision to make. Again, with the pandemic, many people, particularly from the middle and upper classes, who had the possibility to do that and had the possibility to do teleworking, moved away from cities, which were more dangerous in terms of the propagation of the disease, and went to the countryside. Possibly, if we try to look at the present with the eyes of an archaeologist, we would say, look, some people are moving away. They are finding new ways of adapting. And I think in the world, there are today many examples that sometimes are perceived as problems. I gave the example of migrations. I think migrants are very wise people, very courageous and very wise, because they understood it's impossible to have so many people living in their original areas, particularly the so-called climatic refugees, which are often also war refugees, because precisely when the environmental constraints become too disastrous, then war also erupts. And so I think, yes, and in this program of bridges, for example, traditional communities participated in the discussions. We've had meetings with them, particularly one community in Colombia called the Kogi, and the Kogi came, and it's a very interesting experience, as some of us in anthropology and archaeology have this. But it's completely different mindsets. And one important thing is they don't understand us. They can appreciate some things we do, but it doesn't mean they understand everything we think and do, and the other way around. But it doesn't matter. We had a meeting last week, and at some stage we came to this idea: what we have been able to build in this coalition, because this UNESCO program is now a coalition, and part of the coalition are indigenous peoples, is trust. It's trust. One major problem in the planet is mistrust. And I think, again, archaeology is very useful for us, precisely because we understand processes in the global picture, because otherwise we would have a collection of useless, nice eventually, but of very limited use local stories. We do more than local stories. We try to interpret bigger mechanisms, but as David said, we are strongly anchored in sites, in specific cases. And this is, I think, what society needs to be.
Well, thank you very much, Luiz. This talk, I think, even though I think many of us may think that, what they believe in do not completely, resonate with what you were talking about. But I think what you just said will bring an impact on what we have been thinking. Because, for instance, the idea of Anthropocene, we're so used to using that concept. But I believe, that now we have to, more or less rethink the way we use the concept, even though we may not want to ditch the concept, but maybe we, well, some of us have overemphasized the agency of the humans in terms of, changing the face of the globe. So I think, among other things, your talk has more or less taught us to be humble, to become human again, in terms of trying to cope with this crisis that we've been facing. Thank you again for giving us this interesting talk amidst your very, very busy schedule. And I'd like to also to thank all the audience in front of the YouTube, as well as our colleagues from the Department of Anthropology for joining us and bringing us this very enthusiastic conversation. Well, we have to stop sometime.
Let me just, if you allow me just to thank you, Sebastian, but also Professors David and Chung for the questions. I must say that most of the friends with whom I work would not necessarily agree with me. I think the role of university is to debate, and I try to bring you a certain number of considerations. Of course, I believe in what I said, but I'm not completely sure I'm right. I might be wrong. And what I fear always in university is when there is the idea that someone believes we found the truth. We don't do that. And I think in general, if we keep these sort of discussions, we will find a better way to not only to think, but also to intervene. And that is useful for society. So I appreciated very much your observations. And I hope we will at some stage meet personally and do a longer discussion, and perhaps with a glass of wine, which can't be drank in the screen.
Maybe we won't be able to do that anyway in any time soon, because we have to adapt, right? But we can still drink. We can still drink online to each other.
Yes, but it's not the same thing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this very, very inspiring talk. We have all, I'm sure we have all bring something back for further, ruminations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all. I'll see you later.